Hello and welcome to PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz. Back-to-back podcast day. Got a little 30-minute USFL review, but you know what, people? It's a 4-team league. We can talk about that and still talk about good old NFL football and fantasy as well. Joining me today to accomplish that very goal, none other than PFF's finest, the legend himself, Dwayne "The Rock" McFarland. Dwayne, what's up, man?
Oh, dude, good to be back on. Had an interesting last week, but yeah, ready to. And look at me, like you can see, I've changed my monitor stack. Like if I'm looking up like this, and people are like, "What the hell's Dwayne doing?" It's like I'm moving stuff around. Sorry, I haven't figured out how I want to do my camera and everything. I got a new computer, but yeah, dude, it's always a good day to be talking about football. We're getting close to NFL draft. Like it's about to be here, man. It's gonna be here.
Dwayne, you went vertical with the computer setup, something I did many years ago. I like being able to go top down. It feels natural to me when I'm going left to right. I know that's how we read and everything, but I don't know, man. I feel like that's going to, we'll get some neck issues. We could be out of the fantasy analyst game 5 years early, man, if we're going left to right.
Yeah, potentially. I'm still trying to decide, like, do I like it this way, or not? It does feel weird, like kind of looking up. Like you can see me looking up right now. Like I've got my one screen here and my one here. So I'm still getting used to it. I'm sure people they're watching this on YouTube. They're going to be like, what in the hell? Like, where's Dwayne looking? Like there's a UFO above me, like that I keep looking at.
Had a great conversation on the second to last edition of this podcast with Eric Froton. That was recorded on Friday. We went over some of his thoughts on the upcoming RB class. We'll basically be extending that to today's episode with Dwayne, where we have Dwayne's running back tiers up on PFF.com for your viewing, but we're going to talk them through as well. Have some nice visuals out there for our always appreciated YouTube fam. Dwayne, some great stuff. We've talked about these guys a little bit, but you have finally reached the point where we have them tiered. We have them ready to go. It's a great day to be great.
Yeah, and I had taken my first stab at this like back in late February. But like now, the expected draft capital stuff is all really starting to tighten up. We've gotten all the pro day information. And so for backs, we actually do care, more than we do for receivers about some of the, some of those data points. So yeah, just taking the chance to really update it. And bring in all the new information, and just we'll continue to tweak it over the next couple of weeks. But yeah, I'm interested. I know you've also been looking at some stuff around pass catching ability and some different things like that. So hopefully we can weave all that together. But yeah, as far as these rookies, it's an interesting class because we've talked about this a few times already. It's not as heavy as some of the classes we've had in the past. But there are a handful of guys that we do like. There's a 1A, and then there's kind of the next group, and like the third group is really like, hey, we have a bunch of guys that they didn't really get a lot of production in college, but we know that they're probably going to get NFL draft capital. And then you got another group below that's like, well, they were really productive in college, but we don't know if they're going to have NFL draft capital. And then you have a group below that was like, not really that productive in college, but wow, they did some of the stuff that people want to see as far as being explosive, the career explosive rush rates, the 40-yard dash times, the broad jumps, all those sort of things. So it's interesting. It's like pretty much with any time we talk about fantasy football, right? The first group, you're really looking for the players that you think have all of it. And then you start working your way down into, okay, these players may have these traits, but they don't have these others. And so I think it's pretty defined, though, this year. Like, this is honestly, even though it's not as deep of a class, like it's the most clear that I can remember my tier breaks feeling like really strongly about where I have those. Now, once we have the real draft capital, obviously, that will change some.
That was kind of one of the interesting parts when I was going through today. I was looking at an article on PFF.com, the receiving ability of all these running backs, because at the end of the day, we are looking for the diamond in the rough, that running back that can work across all three downs, run the ball, catch the ball, and pass block well enough to get that workhorse role at the next level. And I was just going through based on PFF's ranking of them. Now, Mike Renner, PFF draft expert. He's watched these guys far more than I have. He's very good at his job. He knows what he's doing. So I'm not disputing where he's saying these guys should or will be drafted. But I was surprised to see after kind of some guys like James Cook, let's see, Jerome Ford, you had a couple guys that just seemed like more one-dimensional backs, Dwayne. But then you get to some of the later backs. Your Tyler Algiere, excuse me if I'm messing up that name. You had him. Looks like he can work across all three downs, maybe just not quite as explosive as we would prefer. We have our Kyren Williams, who, doesn't seem to have the 3-down size, but proved that he can run, proved he can catch. Maybe it just takes the right team to get him that. There does seem, Rashad White was another one that just seemed a little bit lower in his ranks, but does have that theoretical 3-down ability we're looking for. What we need to figure out, Dwayne, to your point, where are they going with the draft capital? Because that's going to rule a lot. But, I mean, is that just a big thing? Because I guess my big point out of this whole ramble is just that there seems to be more than a handful of these running backs that could be producers at the next level. We need to try to zero in on the guys that will get the actual opportunity to do so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so that's a big part of, so the way this is set up, now I see you're sharing it so everybody can see it, if you're on YouTube, but even if you're just listening, on a pod, like I've got it tiered into 6 different tiers. And so one of the big components is really expected draft capital, right? And on the chart, we've got it listed as expected draft pick. And we know that's got a huge correlation to future fantasy success, because typically the more that you have invested in a player, the more chances they get. Basically, you get more chances to fail, Ian. If somebody, it's just, it's like, I think it's common, nature, like that we do things like that. If you spend a lot of money on something in your life, you're more likely to probably like give it a few chances before you're just like, screw it, like I'm done with this thing. So it's really the same thing with NFL running backs. So the number one driver, as far as the way the model works, is really based on expected draft capital. And then the next component really ties into career yards per game. So that does tie in receiving. And that's really where the receiving stuff comes in. I used to do all the receiving separate. Like I've looked at receiving yards per game. I've looked at target shares, all those sort of things. But I'm trying to and all the stuff that I'm working on, I'm trying to simplify it, because sometimes I think you start double counting things. You know what I mean? Like if you're counting, for example, like vertical and broad jump, like, those two things can be very similar in what they may indicate. And you're looking at 40 time and broad jump. Like a lot of times we can use broad jump and vertical to actually predict what the 40 time is going to be. So for
running backs, I mean, we talked about this with Kevin Cole's findings. I mean, the jumps are far more predictive than the 40-yard dash anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And so using all of those findings, like from our peers and the other folks here at PFF, and really starting to weight these things out. So then I also look at just their best yardage season period. Then I look at their best touchdown percentage season period. And then I look at some really cool new stuff that we haven't really had access to since, 2014 is as far back as we can go. So really, we can only look at running backs that have come out since 2017. So we would have a full data set on their college career. But 2017 through 2020, I really looked at the career explosive rush rate, which is carries of 10 yards or more. And then we all know the missed tackles forced or the avoided tackles per attempt. And then the final thing really just being bringing all those things together, and weighting them, based on which ones are the most correlated to fantasy points over the first 3 years of a player's career. And again, to your point just a second ago, like the draft capital is the hugest thing. So that's one of the biggest changes in the model, is really just inputting the new draft capital where we're at, because the last time I had done it was February. But we can kind of kick it off, and you jump in here too, but like tier 1, Breece Hall, I still have in a tier of his own. And it goes back to what you just talked about. Who do we think has the best chance of really being like this true every down, workhorse, if you will? We can talk about landing spots a little bit if you want. I think I know you did a bunch of work over the previous weeks looking at really the availability of potential carries, targets, things like that on each team. And I know right now we've both talked about this. Like there's questions pretty much across the league with landing spots. I think there are a few examples that would be great. Like if Breece Hall landed in Buffalo, people would probably get as you would say, Ian, borderline erotic. Like people would probably go nuts. But there's questions everywhere. Like Breece Hall's been linked to Tampa Bay. Like if Breece Hall lands in Tampa Bay, really how excited are we going to be about him this year? Dynasty, yes, he would still be the number one back overall. But I think Hall is the one for me, Ian, that really does check, all the boxes. He's got the, age is obviously in the model and weight are in the model too. I didn't mention those, but 21.3. So he's going to be the second youngest back in the class of the top guys that I have tiered. He's got the best draft capital expected, 42. He's over the weight, 210. He's at 217. His career yards per game, 129. That's the second best in the class. His best yardage season, 37%. That's top 6 in the class. Best touchdown rate, 50%. His career explosive rush rate, 14%, a little bit lower than what we want to see with some of these other guys. And, I'm not a film expert, just like what you were talking about. I'm not Mike Renner. I'm not, Matt Waldman. I'm not some of these other guys, Jay Moy or even Jetpack Galileo. Like, man, total respect for all their games. But I do watch all these players. In fact, last night I spent the last hour and a half just, as I was falling asleep in my bed, like just had my iPad out, had up, our tool, the back end tool over at PFF Ultimate, and I was just watching Breece Hall every inside zone carry, then Kenneth Walker every inside zone carry, then Isaiah.
You better be careful, Dwayne. I think Mrs. McFarland's gonna throw that laptop out the window if you keep that shit up.
Yeah, well, I waited until like she had already passed out to turn it on and start going. But for sure, when I watch these players, like, man, Hall definitely is the one that checks all the boxes as far as the metrics go. But like my tier 2, I've got Kenneth Walker and Isaiah Spiller. And honestly,
real quick.
Yeah, go.
On Hall, I think your point about him just checking all those boxes is perfect, man. Like Mike Renner, as we're saying, his name as many times as possible on his podcast, said that Breece Hall would have been his RB1 in last year's class over Najee, over Devante Williams, and those guys. Like, there really is no clear hole in his game, except maybe pass blocking. That was the only concern I really saw with Breece Hall, Dwayne. Our official PFF grade on him was better than Kenneth Walker. We'll talk about that concern with him in a minute, but 39.6 versus 34.2, only allowed one less pressure on just 5 more total reps. So we talked about some of these landing spots and just how there really aren't as many as you might think. Overall, only the Ravens, which we can throw out because Dobbins and Gus are going to be back. So throwing them out, Chiefs, Giants, Cardinals, the only teams with at least 50% of their 2021 targets unaccounted for. Giants and Chiefs are also, Ravens, Giants, Chiefs mark 3 of the league's other 4 teams with more than 50%. So there are some teams like the Bills, like the Jets, but man, even on those teams, man, several of those running back teams I think we would have really looked at in February based on how things have gone out, where it's not that they've brought in the additional running backs, that they brought in guys that have already been there, accounted for those carries. And it's not a given that the Jets need to replace Michael Carter or Tevin Coleman and stuff. So a lot of them, the same, issues they had the year before that didn't necessarily lead them to take on an extra running back in the first place. So for me with Hall, the question is, can we get that elusive every down, 3-down roll? Because I think he can handle it for the most part, but it's going to be concerning, Dwayne, if he lands somewhere where there's a clear cut, 3rd down incumbent scat back. You're Nyheim Hines, you're J.D. McKissick of the world, because that pass protection could be the one red flag in this game that people aren't talking about enough.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I actually did some research on this. Really, only 20% of the time that running backs are out on the field in the NFL are they asked to pass block. Yep. The other 80%, they're in the route. So, but that doesn't mean that a coach won't keep them off the field for it. Right.
That's the problem.
So, yeah, that's the problem. And so I do think that there are certain coaching staffs that have figured that out, and they're like, fine, well, we don't really care because we're going to put them in a route anyway. And on those teams, you'll see them have their backs on the route 90% of the time.
Because if your quarterback can process everything fast enough, hopefully he can beat that blitz by throwing it to the guy that was supposed to be covered.
Well, yeah, and it also comes down to talent. Like maybe your guy you have in the backfield is a better route runner than your tight end. You could keep a tight end in a block, right? In that case. So I think there's a lot of different factors that go into it. But I think the biggest takeaway for Breece Hall is, talent on the talent level. He really can do it all. He's probably going to grow into a player that will be. I think he's the guy we probably feel the best about being an every down back. I think the player I feel the next best about being an every down back is Isaiah Spiller, who is in tier 2, but his testing is probably pushing him down the draft board. Now today, our own Doug Kye had, put out an article where he had, sat down with several NFL executives, kind of working the phones, doing his thing, all the contacts that we don't have, that he has. And actually there were some, rumors that Isaiah Spiller, man, could still be an early 2nd round pick. There was even one, NFL person that said, wouldn't be surprised if he went the end of the 1st. So if that happens for Spiller, if he landed in Buffalo, I would feel, not quite as good as Breece Hall because he doesn't check every single box because of the 40-yard dash, because of the broad jump. At the end of the day, Ian, once the draft capital's there, we've seen Isaiah Spiller be an every down player. And so I know that he can do it. Is he as explosive, as, Breece Hall? Actually, if you want to ask, 16% career explosive rush rate versus 14% for Breece Hall, despite the fact that Breece Hall ran a 4.3940, Isaiah Spiller ran a 4.63, and then you talked about the jumps earlier, did not do well, 114 and 33. Look at their 10-yard splits, 1.59 for Spiller, 1.54 for Breece Hall. But I still believe that if Spiller, all it takes, Ian, is one team to believe in Spiller. And Buffalo is one of the teams that have actually been connected to him. He's had a visit after the combine with Buffalo. So I think Spiller's a name to still keep an eye on. Like if he were to get drafted, say, right after Breece Hall, but land in a better spot, like I think there's a chance that everybody changes their mind on Spiller. It's funny. Spiller was someone everybody loved. And as soon as the combine happened, like I think it's gone too far, in my opinion. Like I've seen people push Spiller just too far down their boards. I still think he belongs in the second tier. What are your thoughts?
He's at a minimum, like let's say he does fall in the draft and he goes third, fourth round or something like that we're not necessarily expecting or hoping for. But if he can get a backup job even in the NFL and the starter goes down, he has everything that we've seen to be a 3-down back. Now, maybe it's not as explosive as we would like, but I believe the comp in our draft guide was for, I don't think it was for Devante Booker. One of these guys had Devante Booker comp that I thought kind of fit Spiller to an extent in terms of like, I understand Devante Booker isn't everyone's like favorite running back that we're trying to target in Fantasyland, but he can play across all 3 downs, even if he doesn't have that home run hitting, deep speed, take it to the house at any second type of ability. So Spiller stuck out to me. PFF not quite as high as him, but in terms of what he's been able to do, man, aside for some slight pass blocking concerns, which, spoiler, a lot of these guys have, they are college running backs after all. Spiller did stick out as someone that, depending on the spot, could actually make do with a lot of this work. If we can check,
and the youngest guy, man, 21. He and Hall are essentially the same. Hall will be 21.3 years old when the season starts. Spiller 21.1. So typically, when we see players from these programs like this that are really productive at a young age and they're already coming out, which basically means their agents have told them, right, you're going to do well in the NFL draft. That's where part of that feedback loop comes from, and they decide to go ahead and come out. Like it's typically a good thing. And so for me, like I just think the combine stuff, I get it. It's definitely not a positive. I would rather him done well in all of these different tests. But I think at the end of the day, if you still have 4 or 5 teams that believe in him and he ends up having good draft capital, and we know that he's a young back coming out, he's done, he's performed well. He's one of only, 2 or 3 guys in the class. I'm trying to remember. So he was one of the only guys. So as a freshman, he averaged 103 yards per game. And so he was one of only 2 other guys in the class that did that. So, I mean, he's been doing this since a very early age. This isn't something that just, go ahead.
And the one note I saw in the PFF draft guide about Spiller in particular was that if you look at his raw numbers over his 3 seasons at Texas A&M, because he was their starting running back all 3 years he was there, the raw numbers don't change much, but you did see him actually start racking up those missed tackles at a much higher rate in his last season there. So it seems like he's improving, seems like he could be extending. Hey, man, if he's the 3rd running back off the board, I think we're going to see a lot of people all of a sudden changing their opinion on those athletic measurables.
Well, he has a chance to be the 2nd off the board still. I think he's being completely written off by, how we get in our own echo chamber on Twitter, the fantasy universe, and the NFL has different ideas sometimes. I think this could be one of those situations that could surprise us. The other guy in this tier is Kenneth Walker. So, the big challenge with Walker really is, you hit on it right off the bat. Like, can he be an every down back? And so here are my thoughts on that. Yes, overall, we would much rather have a back that's done it before, because that gives us that historical performance. It's much more likely that they can carry that through. An NFL team has seen it on film. They want to deploy the player in that way. But what I will say is we've seen guys come out, and like A.J. Dillon, nobody thought A.J. Dillon could do anything around catching passes, right? And he came out this last year and he did fine. What I would say about Walker is this: like, he's not going to be this huge part of a passing game. He's not going to be a guy working down the field, doing some of the stuff that Spiller and Breece Hall can do. However, if he lands in the right offense, and it's an offense that, say, isn't loaded with 3 or 4 receivers, like, they can still scheme up a lot of things for guys behind the line of scrimmage. Like, so most backs in, this, you're a college linebacker, most backs can catch a swing pass. Like, where the real talent comes, you're running wheel routes, bullet routes, angle routes. You're having to create separation. You're having to run more technical routes, a lot more going on with the fluidity of your hips, all these other different things that are going on, awareness of zone coverages, things like that. Whereas if you're just running a swing pass, or you're checking, to see if there's a blitz, and then you're just kind of floating into the flat to be the 3rd or 4th read on a play, like, most backs can handle that. So a lot of times where some of these targets come from for the backs that aren't, the true difference makers, like a Christian McCaffrey, an Alvin Kamara. I would even argue that Aaron Jones probably is right there on the verge of being in that same group. Those guys, you design things to get them in your passing game no matter what. Like, and it's pretty sticky year over year. But then you have other guys that, if all of a sudden you find yourself on a team that you've got, an okay wide receiver 1, a decent wide receiver 2, no tight end. Like then all of a sudden, we've seen guys like Mark Ingram do this in the past. Where all of a sudden, remember, Mark Ingram could never catch passes until he did. And I don't want to get into the habit of like using, you don't want to make exceptions for everything. We would much rather Kenneth Walker have shown us that he could do this in college. But there can be different reasons for why that doesn't work. And the reason I'm willing to give him a little bit of a pass is, dude, like, I mean, you're showing the visual, like he lights things up across the board. I mean, he'll only be 21.9, 211 pounds. His expected draft capital's moved up after the combine due to his 4.38 40. His 1.49 10-yard split was the best at the combine of the guys that we're really considering here. 42% best yardage season. So dominator. Sorry, not dominator, 42%, whatever. I did touchdown separate, 54%, career explosive rush rate, 17%. So that's better than Breece Hall. It's better than Isaiah Spiller. James Cook and Pierre Strong and Kennedy Brooks were the only guys in the class that were better than that. And so that's actually above the college average. And then his career average, as far as avoided tackles per attempt or missed tackles forced, 33%. So like the other challenge with Walker, though, is we didn't see him really do it when he was a young player. Like he had to transfer, so that creates questions. But man, like he is so far above and beyond most of the other backs in this class and how well he performed. It wasn't like he just got volume because they just wanted to hand it to him. He also was very efficient on the volume. And when you watch Kenneth Walker, like I don't know how much you've got to watch him, Ian, but to me, he's the most, and this doesn't, necessarily mean we move him way up our boards. He's the most exciting back to me to watch in the class. Like he
wins every way possible with the ball in his hands. It's electric to watch.
Yeah, and like he's the one that can turn nothing into something. Like he's the one most likely to do that. Like I think he's a better as far as being a pure runner, I think he's better than Breece Hall. Like just when you watch them. Now again, like I put more of my weight into the data and numbers because I'm not a film expert. Like I do try to brush up on my chops on it. I try to learn from people that know what they're doing and I watch it, but Kenneth Walker's just fun. Like, especially, man, when you watch him run that inside split zone, where they run the duo and they block down a little bit. And you get that, you got a tight end or somebody scrape into the backside to seal off, right? Because the linemen are kind of all moving the other way. Man, he is always a threat to cut that thing back. Like, it's just fun watching him. Now, he gets himself into trouble too, because a lot of times he will cut back and all of a sudden there's like 3 defenders there and he'll still make like the first one miss. But, it's all of a sudden he's like, wow, I still have 2 other guys to beat. But like he does things like Breece Hall can't do that. Breece Hall does not have that in his game. Isaiah Spiller has some similarities to him, but not quite as explosive. Once he gets to the second level, like he can really wind through the defenders. That's the other thing I noticed. It's not just making the first guy miss. He can make the first guy miss and then tack on 10 yards, and he can sometimes beat the angle on the third level to the safety in the corner. He's also physical enough, to your point, that he can run through the tackles of the corner. Dude, he had some crazy plays. Like if you go watch his Rutgers game, that, the long run he had in that one. I know most people talk about the one first game of the season against Northwestern. Like that was just a great block play. Like he made a good cut and he was gone. But like go watch Rutgers. Go watch this play this guy has. And it's great block up front. Like it's actually a split zone play, but the middle ends up opening up. He stays true to the lane, but man, then he runs away from the linebacker, gets around the cornerback, right? Then makes a cut on the safety and then and this is like a 70-yard run and still has the speed to get all the way to the end zone and not get tracked down. That's the thing I didn't see as much from Spiller. Spiller could get to that second level, and maybe that's what's showing up for us, right? When you look at his combine data, once he would get to that second level, not as good as Kenneth Walker as far as just running away from the defense.
The transfer thing was a legitimate question for me because I was like, what if – because he had a good year at Wake Forest, but he was just more so their goal line back and he wasn't getting the same level of opportunity. Maybe just a coaching practice, nothing against Walker. And I just wondered, like, okay, if Walker was every bit as good as he was at Michigan State, still at Wake Forest, like, would people still be ranking this Wake Forest running back as potentially the overall RB1 in the class? But it's after digging a little bit more, Dwayne, because as we get new information, we change our opinions, that I do feel more comfortable with Walker. One, because of how high the NFL seems to be on him, at least in terms of if these mock drafts mean anything about what's going to happen, which I do think they are more correlated than just pulling names out of a hat. hat or something like that, it does make sense that Kenneth Walker should be prioritized, arguably and probably only behind Breece Hall. And Dwayne, when I see you, my lovely colleague, pulling out stuff like this, showing that Kenneth Walker on inside zone, outside zone, man, power, pull, lead, counter, trap, you picked the run concept. He was better in missed tackles force, yards after contact, stuff rate, and explosive rush percentage, almost across the board compared to Breece Hall, man. So we do have the questions about receiving. With that said, though, high school
outside of the receiving, but as far as in the running,
but high school, man, he caught 64 passes. I mean, what running back at Michigan State is catching 50 passes a year anyway?
Ian, like whenever I typically and again, I don't have data to support this, so I want to be careful here, but this is just me kind of floating out a theory. It's something I would have to dig into further. But like when you look at these profiles of the backs that have really struggled catching passes in the league. Like to me, it's more of that stiffer, straight line, power kind of runner. Like
you could just say Peterson. Ronald Jones.
Yeah, Ronald Jones, Adrian Peterson. There's quite a few of them, but it has to do with really, their flexibility and their hips and all these different things. But when I watch Walker and the way he moves, man, I'm like, this guy's as flexible and as limber as anyone in this class. So I kind of, he reminds me not really of Le'Veon. He reminds me of Le'Veon Bell in ways. He's more explosive than Le'Veon Bell. Probably doesn't have quite the same vision as Bell and quite the same patience that Le'Veon had. But there's some of that to his game. He's very, he can change, he can move on a dime. I don't know if you have any film that you can pull up of Walker that people could see, but like when you watch this guy run, man, he's very fluid. And it just makes me think, and again, I don't have data to back this, but when I look at that and I look at how well he moves in space, with defenders coming at him from all directions, man, it just feels like that's a guy that like you could get your arms around, pass catching for him, especially if it's just the check down kind of stuff, but I feel like, man, maybe there's a little bit more that they could even, harvest out of Kenneth Walker just watching the athlete that he is.
Unfortunately, no more college film showing YouTube had to demonetize one of our episodes because I was showing some James Cook receiving goodness. Come on. I know we're not the only podcast showing college highlights. I don't get YouTube sometimes. PFF comp for Kenneth Walker, though, is D'Angelo Williams. Again, I'm not so concerned about the pass game ability receiving-wise, Dwayne. I think you nailed it. Like, is he going to be Austin Eckler? Almost assuredly not. I think he can catch, like Jonathan Taylor did, though. What was Jonathan Taylor year one? Like 35 catches on 36 targets or something? If you put the ball between his numbers within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage, I'm guessing more times than not, he'll come down with the pass. What concerns me is when I see Mike Renner saying that Walker has to buy in as a pass blocker to see a bell cow role in the NFL. Coaches at the next level won't let him see the field on passing downs with what he put on tape as a pass blocker in 2021. So that would be like my tiebreaker for these guys.
Yeah.
Is the pass blocking at even an acceptable level? In Walker's case, doesn't seem to be. He has the size for it. We're not talking about, 185-pound scat back that just physically can't hold up. Hopefully he improves that effort when he's now being paid.
And just remember, it's like you said earlier, most backs, honestly, come into the league with pass protection challenges.
Although,
and look, it all ties together with backs don't get, a lot of passing work in college. Why? Because a lot of times, what do they want in college? They want they want the guy that they trust in pass protection. They're not going to have them running the route. Like the NFL, they're also a different league. Like, so the way that players get, coached, the way they run the schemes also allows for a player that may not be quite as good, like to get on the field. And we'll talk more about that once we know landing spots. Like, does Walker land in a place where that could potentially be the case? End of the day, I would much rather have just seen it all on tape, but I'm hopeful for Walker, not trying to just talk people into it. But I think, look, a lot of guys have pass blocking problems when they come to the league.
This next tier is very interesting. Tier 3, you got Rashad White, James Cook, Zamir White, Brian Robinson, and Damien Pierce. Now, again, got all this pass blocking knowledge fresh in my brain. All these guys, other than Pierce, have some red flags. Rashad White has the effort, not the technique. James Cook was never asked to at Georgia. Zamir White had James Cook at Georgia, so usually he was the one receiving. Either way, Zamir White just wasn't a big-time factor on passing downs. Brian Robinson got dinged with it in the PFF draft guide. With that said, he does have the weight, and he put some fun reps out there in the Senior Bowl, I believe was the all-star event I was watching on the old Twitter sphere. Either way, those four have some problems, but Dwayne, Damien Pierce is someone that you messaged me about probably like 2 months ago when he first started looking at this stuff and just asking me if I had thoughts about him because he kept popping and everything. Now here I am, a little bit later starting to do some of the similar research, and I am seeing the same exact thing, my friend. Only 4 draft-eligible running backs last season had 70-plus PFF grades in rushing, receiving, and pass blocking. Damien Pierce, Tyler Algiere, Hassan Haskins, the guy that ripped my freaking heart out, but we'll worry about that later, and Raheem Blackshear.
He's in tier 5, Ian, just wait.
There we go. Shout out to Raheem Blackshear for making this list as well. But Dwayne, Damien Pierce, man, it wasn't that he couldn't do anything at Florida. He did everything, and he did it all at a pretty damn high level. He just didn't get the volume. But my God, the D weighs 218 pounds. We don't have any seemingly questions about effort and stuff. Damien Pierce, man, is someone where I think if he and a lot of these guys will change if they land the right spot. So I don't want to conclude every single prospect evaluation with that. But I think you have him in this tier for a reason. And I would argue, man, that he can do everything that Spiller and Walker and arguably even Breece Hall can do. It's just a matter of getting that chance to do so.
Yeah, and so this tier we're expecting probably 3rd round to very early 4th round draft capital. So we know there's going to be draft capital, but we're dealing with limited samples on all these players for different reasons, right? And so Pierce, shared the backfield with, some other guys that happen to be in the NFL now, not like LaMichael P. Ryan is like just tearing the league up, but he is an NFL back. I believe he was a 4th round pick, if I remember correctly, somewhere in that range. And I feel like there's someone else that I'm missing, Ian, that he also played, ball with in college and shared the backfield. But, to your point, like he checks a lot of the other boxes. Like of this tier 3, like he's the youngest back, 22.5 years old. He hits the weight, 218. Expected draft pick right now 126, so he could slide a little further than some of these other guys, but we'll see. I kept him, he's close. He was within range. I wanted to keep him, in this tier. The thing that holds him back, in the model really is just, career yards per game. Same thing for James Cook, Zamir White, Brian Robinson. But again, these are all backs, Ian, that shared backfields, with other players like James Cook and Zamir White together. Brian Robinson was freaking behind Najee Harris, for 2 years. I mean, what are you going to do? Najee Harris is there. And I know Robinson is a 5th-year senior, 23.5 years old. But again, 225 pounds. Probably going to go in the first 3 rounds, and we think that he can really do all of it. So again, all of these guys just have the question of we're not 100% certain, like the sample size is small, but the NFL, at least as far as we know right now, based on the information we have, they like these players. They're likely to go ahead of this next group we're going to talk about that actually produced more in college, but the NFL is just not as warm on them. So to your point, we won't sit here and caveat everything with draft capital, but it is a big driver to the way these tiers work, because we just know that, the more that the teams invest in them, again, like the more chances they're going to get. Rashad White's a little different. And his is kind of more similar to Kenneth Walker, right? It's more about it being like we really got this one really good season after a JUCO transfer, 23.7 years old, so he's going to be older, but hits all the other things that we really want. But man, career yards per game, and again, that can be a little skewed too whenever you didn't play as much early on, right? For a guy like Breece Hall that played his whole career, it's more impressive to see his 129 versus Rashad White. That 134 is really from this last season. But again, like in his last season, he did really well. Like it's a small sample, but he checks all these other boxes. Like you got it up. Like look at, Rashad White. If you were just looking at this chart, Ian, like you could argue with me that, dude, like he's green like all the other guys. Like why is he not tier 2?
Yeah.
Like, and I think you have a valid argument. He came out just a notch below, like in the model enough that I just wanted to go ahead and make him in the next tier down because of the big part that knocked him the most, honestly, was his age. Being 23.7 years old and Spiller and Walker just being much younger prospects. So they move up the board, but you could make an argument that if you're just looking at the other stuff, the best touchdown season, the explosive rush rate, avoided tackles per attempt, all that kind of stuff, Rashad White checks a lot of boxes. And so he's a player that we could he could easily jump into that next tier. Like if he is drafted, if for some reason he gets drafted in the top, 3 rounds, 2 rounds, like this says, like a lot of things will come down to who goes first and how far apart they are in the draft.
I'll be really interested to see where these Georgia running backs as well as Brian Robinson go. Because, man, if you were an NFL GM these 10 years ago, just said, all right, I'm going to take running backs from Georgia and Alabama, wherever they're valued, you'd be doing pretty good for yourself. I mean, we can talk about spending too early a draft capital or whatever, but we've seen these universities produce some pretty damn good NFL running backs. And I almost wonder, Dwayne, if Brian Robinson was getting unfairly dinged for the age and just being a bigger back because, I just see him always kind of shoved into the 2-down grinder kind of type of running back. But you look at last year, man, he caught 35 of 38 targets. Like, I don't know what more we want from the guy. Maybe there are pass protections concerns there. Like, Renner and his write-up was basically almost surprised by it, given that he is a 6'2", 225-pound back. But you do see him in some of these all-star games showing up, showing more effort to his skill. Like, would it really shock us if the NFL views the workhorse Alabama running back a little bit higher than Draft Twitter, who's trying to hype up, these Arizona State and Texas A&M guys? It's just something to think about, man, because I think Robinson might have a little bit more of a 3-down ability than we're giving him credit for.
Yeah, I think of this tier, Rashad White and Brian Robinson would be the two that I would say have the best shot at 3-down ability. And I think what you have to look for first, right, is are they good in the receiving game? Because that's the hardest time for the backs to get on the field in the NFL. Like, that's a lot of these guys get stuck, right? They can't get over that hurdle, and then they can't become elite fantasy assets because of that. Whereas Robinson and White, I think of this tier, they would be the most likely. Like, if you had to say on day one, would they be ready to handle a 3-down role? I think it would be those two guys. James Cook, I think, is a very interesting one. His really comes more back to he gets knocked because he's only 199 pounds. He had to share the backfield with Zamir White. But man, and you got us kicked off of YouTube by showing how good of a receiver he is out of the backfield. So I'll let you talk about that. But man, 19% career explosive rush rate. So again, those are carries of 10 plus yards or more. Came out and backed that up with a 4.42 40, did nice in the broad jump at a 124 as well. So not as high on the avoided tackles per attempt, but I don't care. I like it when players can do both of those things, but like have one trait, right? Yeah. If you have one trait that you can really rely on and that's your game. And I think that James Cook's, he's shown that. So when you think about, how good he can be in the passing game and he's an explosive playmaker, to me, you're checking two really important boxes. The only box that Cook, doesn't check for me outside of the production, which we've already talked about, he had to share a backfield. So it's not necessarily apples to apples versus some of these other guys. But the biggest knock is really, the 199 playing weight. But dude, we saw a guy named Jamal Charles like dominate the NFL at that weight. Again, we don't want to get into a habit of making exceptions, but these things do happen. And for me, with a guy like Cook, Ian, what if he could land in a situation where he could get used more like a Kamara or even CMC, his first year where he wasn't really an every down back. He could put on a little bit of weight, maybe by year 2. If he turned into a back that was seeing 50% of the snaps but being used on all the passing downs and he could provide explosive plays, like he's going to have a ceiling. He's going to have a nice ceiling in fantasy. Worst case, I think you're looking at a guy that, comes in and maybe he's just the passing down back, and that's what he ends up being. More like Nyheim Hines, and I don't know, Nyheim Hines, I'm trying to think like J.D. McKissick, not quite like a J.D. McKissick, but like on that level, somebody that can come in and play on the passing downs. But I think he has the upside to give a little bit more than that.
Get James Cook to the Cardinals and ask questions later as I'm tweeting during the show. That'd be perfect. Let James Conner do his stuff.
What are you doing to James Conner, man? Come on, we've been pumping James Conner.
we just want James Conner to have 500 touches next year, and then never be able to walk for the rest of his life. Okay,
we don't want that second part, but
correct. Just being a jerk here. Isaiah Spiller, I mentioned before how I thought he had Devante Booker comp. No, it was actually Tyler Algiere, the BYU running back that was comp to Devante Booker. I then was talking about how Algiere and Spiller were similar in that they have the ability to work across 3 downs. So my bad on mixing that up a little bit. Either way, man, Tyler Algiere, he checks every single box without necessarily having an elite skill. And he doesn't have that big play explosive ability. Relatively modest 17% explosive rushing percentage, not far from the worst on this list. But I think when you look at that 4.6 40 and you're just not exactly seeing the same level of explosiveness, wouldn't be shocked if he falls into more like if we had to bet on which running backs are probably going to be backups, my money would be on him. And I think that kind of is the story of this tier. We have Tyler Beatty, who's going to have some problems getting the early down work at 197 pounds. Jerome Ford, Pierre Strong, 23 and 25 years old, respectively. Even Kyren Williams, just 194 in terms of weight. So out of this group, Dwayne, I think Kyren intrigues me the most because of what he was able to do at Notre Dame as a receiver. Mike Renner called him, I believe, the most willing pass blocker in the entire class. I am correct on that. Gotta love that. And I think just basically, man, if we're looking about what James Cook can do and what he can't do, Kyron Williams seems like a similar version of that player. Not as good, doesn't have the NFL pedigree, but someone where they can catch the passes. And that's what we want first and foremost. And it's not like they can't run the ball. We know guys like J.D. McKissick, Darren Sproles back in the day. These guys were capable of running the football, just a matter of getting those carries. If we can check off those fantasy-friendly targets, which for guys like DeAndre Swift is usually more than enough anyway, man, like maybe we should be gambling more so on guys like Kyren and James Cook over the plotters that we don't even know if they can catch.
Yeah, so this tier actually provides you with a group of players that have a ton of upside should they surprise in draft capital. Why? Because they have a good production profile already. So if you look at the players at the top, like Breece Hall, it's a great production profile. We know he's going to have draft capital, did what he needed to do on his athletic testing. Then you got the next group. It's high draft capital with a good but not great production profile. Maybe have some questions, for example, with Isaiah Spiller around, the way he tested. Then the next group, tier 3, we just talked about. We know there's going to be draft capital based on, at least we think there is, based on what the mocks are saying right now, but we don't have a big sample. This next group, we've actually, these players have all proven it in one way or another. Like if you're looking at if you're on YouTube and you're looking at it right now, like again, like a lot of these players, when you look at how green they are, like they're borderline deserving to be in tier 2. The big difference is the fact that we are not expecting their draft capital to be as good. So for some reason, all of a sudden a team does fall in love with Tyler Algiere. Tyler Beatty, he's got the question with the weight, but Jerome Ford, Pierre Strong. If all of a sudden Pierre Strong went, at the end of the second round, despite his age, which we don't think he will, but if he was a surprise in draft capital, like, look, he checks a lot of the other boxes. Wouldn't quite be on the level as, Breece Hall or Kenneth Walker, but you could argue, he's pretty close to where Isaiah Spiller is, just would be older. So there could be one of these players from this group that could really surprise. Kyron Williams, fits in there as well. He's very similar to Isaiah Spiller. It's just he came out and he didn't test well. He's small and he's slow. And so, the NFL, I really don't think his draft capital is probably going to recover. But if it did, like, he does have enough on his production profile, to really take a step forward. And I do think that Kyron's one of those guys that could come in, Ian, and right out of the gate, just carve out a role as a receiver, on a team. Carve out a role as a passing down back, like you mentioned, with James Cook. Doesn't have the same explosive upside. James Cook, 19% career explosive rush rate, only 13% for Kyren Williams. And so if you look at, just the guys that we have here that are available to be drafted, the average is 16%. The college average over the last 3 years is like right at 15.5% career explosive rush rate. Or actually it might be like, it's 14.5%. Sorry. So he's still even below that. 13%. So Kyren, the 40 time, the issues that he had, even once he came back, with his pro day, wasn't really able to improve his stock, but could really be a good receiver out of the backfield. But again, somebody from this group, like if they get taken in round 3 would be my guess, Ian, would be like a surprise for one of these players. But if Algiere went in round 3, like I would be excited about that. 224 pounds, 22.4 years old, has a good production profile. 40 time isn't great, but again, we've talked about the 40 time. Like it's really more about a threshold. It's like you can't let it just be the eliminator. It's not like going to completely eliminate Tyler Algiere. If a team's willing to invest the pick, his production profile is good enough that I would still be willing to use a dynasty pick. Man, I'm tongue-tied today for like not having to talk for like 2 days.
We're excited, Dwayne. We're excited. I would be curious to see, because with all these guys having 40 times, maybe it's only at the combine, but do you have 10-yard marks for all of them? Because I'd be
1.59 for Algiere, 1.54 for Beatty, Jerome Ford 1.55. Pierre Strong Jr. is a 1.50. So he ran a 4.37 and had the 10-yard split of the 1.50.
But that's not helping Algiere's problems.
No.
Okay,
no.
That's fair. I was just wondering.
But your guy in the tier before, Damien Pierce, it helped him. He ran a 4.59 40-yard dash, almost the same as Tyler Algiere, but a 1.51 10-yard split, which was the second best in the class.
Wasn't that like that was one of the conversations about Treylon Burks, right? Like, yeah, the 40 itself wasn't great. Yes. And I know wide receivers is a little different than running back, but I think that burst, especially at running back, is more indicative of future performance.
Yeah, once you adjust for, the size, you hear everybody talk about speed score, right? Which is you're taking your 40-yard dash, you're combining it with your weight. There's a formula used to do that, but 10-yard split, you can think about it similarly. So guys that really stick out to me based on their 10-yard split and their weight, Damian Pierce at 218 with a 1.51, Zamir White at 214 with a 1.51, and then Kenneth Walker at 211 with a 1.49, Breece Hall at a 1.54 at 217 pounds. And then the last one is Pierre Strong at 207 pounds at a 1.50. Those guys all stick out to me.
That is hot. Before we get on Dwayne's 5th and 6th tiers, I want to let y'all know that right now you can get 50% off a PFF Elite annual subscription if you use code DRAFT50 with 365 days of Elite. You can get all of PFF's locked article content. Our PFF NFL Draft Guide just got released with a new spring edition. All sorts of guys being covered, 250 plus 3-page scouting profiles, our completely unlocked mock draft simulator, data and grades from the entire 2021 and upcoming 2022 seasons. That is promo code DRAFT50 for, again, 50% off a PFF Elite annual subscription. Why not? If you feel like you're going to use our help at any point in the year, might as well get 50% off on it now. Again, that's promo code DRAFT50 for 50% off a PFF Elite annual subscription. Also, be sure to check out Hutch, a four-part podcast series with #1 overall NFL draft prospect Aiden Hutchinson on all podcast platforms. Dwayne, I try not to get in the weeds on Twitter that often. I try to tweet and then interact with people that usually are responding to my tweets because I don't care if you follow me or whatever, but if you want to talk ball, I'm always here to talk ball. The amount of shit that, for the 20th time we'll mention in this podcast, Mike Renner was getting for making an objective statement about Hutchinson being a better athlete than the Bosa brothers, it's absolutely crazy to me. Better player, better prospect? No. I would not agree with that, and I would say slander the man. But an athlete, we have the NFL Combine to determine how good of athletes they are. We have our rack athleticism testing scores to help with this. If you look at every single 40-yard dash, 10-yard split, 20-yard shuttle, 3-cone, vertical, broad jump, Hutchinson, compared to the Bosa brothers, is first in about 5 of those categories and second in the other 2. Same size. Aiden Hutchinson is objectively a better athlete than Nick and Joey Bosa. An athlete. Not a player, not a prospect. Open your eyes and read, everyone. Mike had George freaking Kittle quote tweeting this, calling him like an idiot. And it's just amazing to me, Dwayne. That must be, that's the equivalent of what we go through when we release our fantasy ranks and people misinterpret them as real life ranks. When there's fantasy in large letters on the freaking graphic. So I don't know, man. It's 2022. Just read the damn thing before you go try to dunk on these people, because now you're just making yourself look dumb. So Aiden Hutchinson, check out that 4-part series. Find out all about that and so much more. Great work from Dave Safaro, Austin Gale, and the entire PFF gang. Also, everyone, I want to point out that the only true guaranteed quality pickup this season is Manscaped, the leaders in below-the-waist grooming. With Manscaped Performance Package 4.0, your skill position will be sleek and smooth enough for a sub-4 340. Support us and head to manscaped.com and use the exclusive code PFF at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. Again, that's 20% off with free shipping at manscaped.com and use code PFF. Turn your Mr. Irrelevant to a first-round pick with Manscaped. Now, Dwayne, looking at your handy-dandy chart here, it looks like this was the point where you said, okay, those are our running backs. We have 13 running backs with an expected draft pick of 161 or lower, or higher, I should say. Between 1 and 161, the rest of these guys are either not projected to be drafted necessarily, or they're falling down in the ranks. Are these next, 9 running backs, guys that checked a lot of boxes for you, but just right now, probably not expecting them to go high enough in the draft to be a relevant factor?
Yeah, productive players, but the very questionable, draft capital. You could argue Pierre Strong and Kyron Williams could fall into this group if they slip enough in the draft. But it's kind of close with some of these guys, where we're drawing the line. But, all of these guys, what they have in common, if you look at their best yardage season, they're all green. Look at that. It's pretty green right down the middle. And for those that are listening, they're like, dude, I can't see green. So best yardage season. So percentage of their team's yardage. So Kevin Harris, 39%. Kennedy Brooks, 34%. Sincere McCormick, 38%. Tyler Goodson, 34%. Hassan Haskins, 42%. So, those are all better than the last 2 tiers. Almost all of them are better than the last 2 tiers we've talked about.
We talked about 13 running backs at first, and only 4 of them have better best yards percentages than these 5 guys. They were balling out with their opportunities.
Yeah, but their weaknesses showed up in 2 ways. One, in the data, the career explosive rush rates are they're worse. They're worse than what we see from the guys ahead. They're also worse in career tackles avoided per attempt than the guys above. So these are guys that the NFL probably has rightfully said, look, they were production in college. Their team gave them the ball, but we're not sure their skills translate to the NFL. The exception to the description we just gave is really Kennedy Brooks. What kept him down here is 23.9 years old when the season starts for the NFL next season. I didn't even know this. Someone told me on Twitter, like, and he has like 7.3-inch hands. I don't know how that's possible, Ian.
7'3"?
I mean, that is really, really small.
Oh, no.
Like, yeah. So I don't know that he'll ever be a receiving prospect. But with Kennedy Brooks, 21% career explosive rush rate. That's the best in the class. So again, that's carries of 10 yards or more. Career avoided tackles per attempt, 31%. That is third best in the class. So he actually has a couple of traits, as a rusher that could stick out to a team and be enough to really get him drafted. We'll have to see where these guys land. So they all have holes in their game one way or another, but mostly it's guys that were productive at college, but the underlying skill set, the athletic testing doesn't really align with the production that they have, and the expected draft capital is also not aligning. Now, again, we can be wrong on these things. Sometimes the NFL thinks very differently than the way, some of the mocks go. To your point, I was kind of surprised historically, like they're much more accurate than what I would have ever thought, because I hadn't really studied them that much until this year. But some of these players, could end up surprising us, and a team does like them. And so if that happens, it's a guy that we'll have to talk about again, when the time comes. I know Hassan Haskins was the guy we could talk about real quick, just because I know you want to, Ian.
Real quick before we get to all homerism aside. Yeah, this is wild. Kennedy Brooks, 7 5/8-inch hands. I thought, okay,
7 5/8. Okay, yeah.
But like my first thought was maybe like the 9-inch hand thing is like just something we'd look at quarterbacks for, and other players don't have these huge hands. No, every other running back that got measured had at least 8.5-inch hands. The fact that Kennedy Brooks is that much lower is absolutely madness.
It's weird.
Real quick, the only guy before we get to Haskins that I would mention is intriguing, Dwayne, is Tyrion Davis-Price, Eric Frotons. He's calling him the potential next Elijah Mitchell, just based on someone that could not even be drafted, but actually come in and get the job done. Had a real nice stretch at the end of his LSU career, and PFF's single highest graded pass blocker from last season, Tyrion Davis-Price. And if you got a hyphen in your name, there's a good chance you're going to be good at football. That just seems to be the way.
I shared my screen with you, Ian, if you want. So bonus for people listening to the podcast, because this isn't even posted on the site, but they can see. So once I'm sharing, but basically a lot of these other guys, and we can just hit on any of them that you want. But Tyrion Davis-Price, I do have all of his data, so he's second from the bottom. Let me blow it up a little bit for people here. And let me freeze this. Boom. So once we have that done, now scroll down here. So I know you mentioned him, but yeah, 21.9 years old. He's LSU guy, weight 211. Career yards per game, lower. But again, another guy that had to share with, some other really good players that were in the backfield. Decent on his best yardage. Didn't really pop in any of these others, though. The career explosive rush rate, only 12%, so below the NCAA average. 17% avoided tackles per attempt, also below. But he did solid in the 40, 4.48, and his 10-yard split, 1.54. But one thing, that I have heard several people talk about with him, and that may be the same thing that you're alluding to here, is he could be a potential every down option. That he's a guy that a lot of people do believe could be on the field all the time.
All right, now let's talk about the guy that last November, shortly after Thanksgiving, rushed not one, not two, not three, not even four, but 5 freaking touchdowns against my Ohio State Buckeyes. I'll be honest, Dwayne, I didn't even know who this dude was when you live in Columbus and you just stomp that school up north, for the better part of the last 2 decades, you just start disrespecting him year in and year out at some point. But him and that Michigan O-line obviously had their day. 20 total touchdowns on the year, just 18 catches. But, again, Michigan State, Wisconsin, Michigan, show me the running back that was catching a bunch of passes in these offenses. What are your overall thoughts on Haskins, Dwayne, and if he can actually maybe rise up into tier 4 or so with the right landing spot?
Yeah, I think tier 4 is where he would go. It'd be hard for me to push him higher. I just don't think he'll get enough draft capital. But I mean, the reason I wanted to talk about him, he is one of the players that the expected draft capital is climbing. Okay. So we've got a few different guys here that have really been rising, and Haskins is one of them. But you can see what the NFL likes. 228 pounds. He handled 42%, of Michigan's yards in his best season, 50% best touchdown. Share as well. So like he's been a productive player in a big system, big player. Like it just smells like the NFL. And so that's why he's probably creeping up, in expected draft position. because all these people that are doing a lot of these mocks, they're talking to people in the league. And so I'm sure Hassan Haskins is a name that continues to come up. I did study him last night. He was a player that I threw on the tape, and I also compared to Kenneth Walker as well as Breece Hall. I did it with a few other guys, just looking at inside zone, outside zone, power rushing. He didn't really pop out to me in any way, because when these players start rising like this, it makes me go back and look at them again. So I just kind of start digging into everything. We don't have any of his, we don't have a 40-yard dash on him. We don't have any of, his athletic, testing, because he did not, participate in any of those drills. So there are still questions. But I think what the NFL sees is just the big player, the big production for a big school. So we'll see where he goes. But there wasn't anything, man, that just jumped out to me at all, enough to make me think, well, wow, maybe I should move him closer to the top of this tier, or maybe should I be thinking about him in the tier 4? It just wasn't the case. He didn't check enough boxes.
4 final running backs make up your tier 6. Max Borghi, Zonovan Knight, Jaren Healy, and Keontae Ingram. Any final thoughts on these guys, Dwayne?
Yeah, so this final tier, I'll just kind of, it's really players that they have these underlying traits that are popping, but they don't have expected draft capital, and they also don't have really a good production profile. So if you're looking at it on the screen we're sharing now, I went from green and yellow to red and green because of some feedback I got, on the ability to, for some folks to be able to see the color scale I was using. So trying to always improve, Ian. And I think you've talked to me about that before too. But the career explosive rush rate for all these guys. So for Max Borghi, 19%. Zonovan Knight, 17%. Jaren Healy, 18%. Keontae Ingram, 17%. I will say on Ingram, it all came on wide zone. If you ask him to do anything else, like, it really drops off in the data. And when you watch him, he doesn't really have like that change of direction. He's a player that's kind of like, if I were to give a comp, like the best part of his games kind of remind me of Ryan Matthews back in the day. Like, nice. He had some, he kind of wind through some players, but like just not really able to like stick his foot in the ground, just make that hard cut like what you see with like a Kenneth Walker and some of these other guys, at least in the film, that I watched and in the data that I looked at. But again, the career avoided tackles per attempt, also good for these guys, especially Zonovan Knight, 30%, Jaren Healy, 32%. Now, Jaren Healy, only 189 pounds. He's also another guy, shared the backfield with Tyler Beatty. So he's a guy that, can really work in the passing game as well. So he could end up being someone like a Kyren Williams, some of the other guys that we talked about before, like Cook. So we'll see what happens with Ely. But again, these are just players that they have some underlying things as far as the career explosive rush rate and the tackles avoided that kind of popped, but nothing as far as expected draft capital so far. And production profile was really just meh.
Trying to see if there's anyone else you want to really talk about, but I think that is going to
Yeah, I got the list up here for you if there was anyone. The other guy that popped out to me a little bit, like when I was studying trying to look at guys that could run in all schemes, because I think that's something maybe I should do like a quick piece on before the draft, like maybe the 10 backs that have demonstrated their ability to really, it doesn't matter if you're going to run a gap or a power scheme, you want to run more inside zone, which inside zone and outside zone are the two biggest they're the two biggest rushing plays in the NFL. Now, there's different variants, right, of that. But if you look at those two, they make up I think outside zone is 28%, and I want to say inside zone is like 26% over the last 3 seasons. So they're the biggest. And then you get into really your gap and power plays. You start getting into smaller samples like counter, pulling, guards, things like that. So I just grouped all of them together. But whenever I was looking at Zawandre White, he was pretty decent, across all of those. He wasn't somebody that looked like he had a lot of holes. He also did have the 32% career avoided tackles per attempt, but didn't test well at the combine. Doesn't really have a super, productive profile. So not somebody like you're just going to, care a lot about. But some of these other guys that we may break down after the draft would be players that maybe we saw in college. They were really good, like in this specific type of scheme. And we know they land somewhere that runs that exact scheme. So like that would have been a great example of last year with Elijah Mitchell, right? When he landed with the 49ers, it could have been something we probably, should have done a better job with.
Well, Dwayne, this will prepare us that much more for preseason and hopefully maybe future USFL and XFL seasons when the guys that don't cut it in the NFL are forced to go play elsewhere. That's going to wrap up the majority of this PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. Just sticking with the running backs today, but Dwayne has some more wide receiver goodness that we'll touch on probably Friday, worst case next Tuesday. Draft right around the corner, though. Cannot wait for that, obviously. So just updated kind of podcast schedule, because I know I'm throwing some of the USFL stuff in there. That will not take the place of any actual, fantasy NFL related podcasts. I'm sure Dwayne and I's bosses would not be too pleased with that, content idea, but it's just something extra. So on Monday or Tuesday, the day after, whenever the USFL games are over, I will do a solo pod quickly reviewing what happened. On Tuesday, Dwayne and I will be back like we always have been throughout this offseason, doing our usual multi-segment episode. Wednesday, we're going to do best ball streams continuing at 5 p.m. Missed last week, but those will be consistent here moving forward. Thursday, it will be Dwayne and I doing a USL-specific preview show, looking ahead to next week, really focusing on DFS, Dwayne's utilization report, things of that nature. And then on Friday, we want to start doing a listener mailbag themed episode, probably talking about some news and happenings, whatever else is on, our chest that day. But definitely want to get you guys' input and talk about whatever you want us to talk about. Good job smacking your desk there, Dwayne, right as I'm trying to get this off my chest. But keep an eye out on Twitter.
Chapstick, Ian, chapstick.
Chapstick. Damn chapstick. All right. I will be sending a tweet out probably Thursday, and I'll try to remind you guys again. But if there are questions you guys want, just respond to my tweet. I'll tag Dwayne in it, and he'll retweet it. Maybe even get the PFF Fantasy account to retweet it, and we'll try to get to all those top questions. I want to tentatively not put a cap on what they want to ask. Dwayne, if we get 100 likes on something gross, maybe we should go into that and see what it is. So ask away, ask about whatever you want. We want to make the Friday episode, as personable as possible for all you guys. So anything you want to add to that, Dwayne, / get off your chest before we get out of here?
No, man. I feel like, I should be like throwing up like 250-pound bench press, like off my chest. Because you're always asking me what I want to get off my chest. Like you make me feel like I need to go work out, Ian. No, man. I think I'm looking forward to getting into the receiver stuff, as well. Hopefully I won't be as tongue-tied like when we come back together on Friday. I don't know what my deal was today. But yeah, and then the USFL stuff. Like I'm looking forward to that on Thursday. To your point, yeah, we would never take away any of the NFL goodness because we just love to talk about it all anyway.
That's what I'm saying, man. Like it's something extra on our play with the USFL. So yeah, if you other content creators out there just want to go and make another mock draft, watch the NBA playoffs, go ahead. I'll embrace a little more football. Why the hell not? For Dwayne, I'm Ian. Thanks to those for tuning in to PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. And until next time, take care, everybody.